Yes, hello everybody. Thank you very much to James and colleagues at UKRIO for the kind invitation to give this webinar, and thank you all for attending. My engagement with social media research ethics has come very much from my review and advisory activity that I've done. It started with a proposal I was reviewing involving Twitter data a few years back, and somehow it's sort of ballooned from there, and it's become something I've been engaged with a lot from an ethics review standpoint. And obviously I don't do this in isolation. I work with lots of colleagues at UCL and elsewhere, and all the discussions I have with them, help to shape the thinking on this. So what I want to try and do today is, obviously we're talking in the context of social media and social media public data, well, in quotes public data, and you'll see why I put it in quotes in a bit. And what I want to do is look at some of the ethics issues involved in that. And primarily what I want to do is offer a suggestion of how to build an ethical defense for doing research in that area. Often I'm asked as a review, is this ethical or not? And I don't think that's really the question. The question is the work that's being proposed ethically defensible? And that's a balance of factors around society. It's a balance of factors around what current culture is saying, the law. So what's considered acceptable? This will vary across nations. It will vary across different areas of research, and so on. And so it's about ethical defense, not this is ethical or this is unethical. I mean, some things we can, probably all agree that are highly unethical. But in terms of how you present an argument to a research ethics committee for doing a piece of work, it's about ethical defense. And I will finish up with what I think are a few points of interest around different sites that I've had cause to look at over time, different social media platforms, and some of the things that they require or they prohibit, and how this might affect research. So that's what I aim to do, is hopefully give you some tools and ways of thinking about building this. And if you're watching this from the kind of governance aspect of it, things that you might look for in proposals from your researchers in justifying the kind of work they want to do. So they are my aims. There are, of course, some limits to what I can do. If you're a researcher, I can't guarantee that by doing some of what I suggest here, you will get ethics approval for your research. Research oversight varies in its risk appetite, in its policy, its procedure, what it considers to be within its scope and such like. So hopefully what I'm saying here will be of use. But I can't guarantee that it will give you ethics approval, nor can I guarantee that your participants won't complain. This is the flip side of ethical defensibility. You may come up with what you consider to be a defense, but that doesn't stop somebody disagreeing with you. And I think within that, we have to acknowledge that this is a research ethics and so on is a very temporally situated thing. This is where we are today, but we've seen lots of discussion and debate around social media platforms and their role in society and the kinds of things they do. And that can sometimes affect change on what they do, and therefore we have to reflect where we are at the time we're doing the research. I'm going to touch in places on law, but I think to make it very clear, I have no legal training. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not your lawyer. This is not legal advice. Okay, I regularly talk to our legal teams as and when I need to gain clarity on things when I'm doing ethics review. So it's useful to know what law is relevant and how it can impact what you're doing as a researcher, or what you're doing from a kind of review, oversight point of view, and governance point of view. But it's important to talk to legally qualified people if this is something that's specific to your area. And obviously, I can't speak to all aspects of every study. Research varies hugely in its scope and topic, and I see this a lot from a computer science point of view, because computer science, we do a lot of theoretical research and kind of core underpinning technology research, but we also do quite a bit of applied research. And so we see ethics issues coming in from lots of different domains that are being enabled by technology. And so the kind of point there, I strongly recommend this paper by Markham, Method as Ethic and Ethic as Method, really makes the point nicely that what you do in your research methods affects your ethics, and what you think about in your ethics affects your research methods. So you need to be reflexive and case specific. And finally, just to say, I'm not representing UCL here today. This is me. So any similarity, as they say in the movies, between my opinions and UCL's are purely coincidental. So let's start by thinking about the kind of data that we're talking about here, the kind of information. And let's imagine a coffee shop. So perhaps you've just been to a coffee shop to fortify yourself for coming and listening to this. But you're there with friends. There's a bit of a buzz. It's quite busy. So you enjoy your conversation, everyone's feeling relaxed and comfortable, and the surroundings start to fade away. So you're chatting with friends, you talk about your health, your family relationships, and that kind of thing. And you know there's people around you, but who's interested in what you're talking about? Following day, you see a newspaper article about family health, and somebody quotes you word for word, repeating something that one of your friends told you. Now, most people aren't going to know it was you, but given the context and the content, your friend probably would, and so might their family too. So you have what you thought was a relatively private conversation, albeit held in a public place, and it's become public. And that could have impacts on your relationships with friends and family. It looks like you've been revealing things publicly that were understood from your point of view to be private. And you're puzzled as to how this happened. Was the coffee shop owner listening in, somebody else? Did the owner of the coffee shop know that they were there and listening, and did they allow it? Okay, it's a slightly contrived example, but it illustrates a couple of things, that these ostensibly public places can be the hosts of both public and private information, and that both types of information can be observed by other people in that context. So there is a context to be acknowledged, public, private, both. And I think there's an aspect of temporality too. So conversations like this are kind of understood to be ephemeral. You have a chat in a coffee shop, you don't expect it to be recorded. If this was on the street, okay, you perhaps might have a different perception of your space, that this might be a public space. Would you have the same conversation? Maybe, maybe not. So, this is a kind of real world example, but the question is, do we see this kind of issue in social media research? Because after all, isn't all social media public? Well, people are actually quite surprised when this sort of thing happens. So this is an article here I'm drawing on by Jane Hughes, a 2019 article. And it reports a machine learning study that was designed to guess somebody's appearance from their voice. And one of the users that is talked about in the article was very surprised to be included because they hadn't been asked for consent. Now, the article claims this is not human subject research, and my understanding is that in terms of US regulation, that may well be the case because of the different national rules about what counts as human subject research or not. Personally, I would consider it human subject research, but your research ethics committee, your research oversight bodies may vary. But the point is, I think that people have a mixed understanding of what publicly available means. So this article quotes a paper by Fiesler and Preferes, and I'm going to talk about the article in a minute, but what they say is that people know Twitter is public, but they really think their audience is just their 200 followers or whoever it is. So people are having what they perceive to be private conversations in what are ostensibly public forums. And of course, you get all kinds of data on YouTube, from the very banal to the highly sensitive. And doing this kind of research can, by its nature, put people in danger because you draw attention to a particular aspect of something that otherwise might disappear in the noise. So research risks arise simply from the focus placed on a particular area of social media research. And of course, we see that informed consent is difficult. How do we gain the consent of our participants? Can we gain the consent of our participants in this? So that's an example of where people were surprised. Fiesler and Preferes have a slightly broader study. They looked at Twitter users in 2018. They surveyed 368. And I've tried to summarize their results here in some charts. This is a very good paper, by the way. I strongly recommend it. It's a very interesting paper. Some key points to draw out from this. 61% of their sample were not aware of the research use of their data, even though this is something that's quite clear. And I think Twitter is now X. It's quite clear on what it says it will do with the data when you sign up to it. Not all sites are, but I think it's not bad for that. But nonetheless, 61% of their sample weren't aware of research use. And of those, nearly 43% think that researchers can't use tweets without permission, which is not what the terms say. And of those, 61% of those think it breaks ethical rules to do so. And 65% of those people think that researchers shouldn't use tweets without permission. So we have some evidence that the understanding that comes to us from reading the terms and now looking at whether we can programmatically access tweets and so on, which says, yes, it's all fine, we've agreed it all with our users, that's not necessarily what users of the site are perceiving. And they delved in a little bit to see what sorts of things people were worried about. Context was one of the particular things. People were concerned about using protected or deleted tweets, which actually isn't permitted by X anyway. The terms don't allow you to do that, but that was nonetheless a concern. Concern about faulty conclusions or bad perceptions drawn on the basis of individual tweets, but without full context. Perceived ownership. So there was a feeling that researchers shouldn't be exploiting this data without compensating people because the tweets aren't given to the public. And actually that's reflected in the position of X in what you can do and how you have to reflect the live data. Concern about things like private, personal, or offensive tweets. Concerns about the nature of the study in terms of whether it would align with the political position of the people whose data is being used, and reputational risk and things like that. And again, concern about unwanted attention on individuals caused by the research, because the research itself could cause risk. And 79.5% of them would want to be informed if their tweet was being used in a study. 84% nearly would want to read the resulting article. So there's a desire evident there for engagement with the kind of research that's happening and information about the fact that it is happening. And I don't think that's, certainly in my experience, always reflected in the way researchers will see this data, because they will look at what the terms say, and the terms say you can have access through the public APIs. So it's one study, but nonetheless, I think it's a very interesting study. So that's about the kind of relationship between the researcher and the participant in the research, albeit potentially an unwitting participant. What about the platforms? What about the companies? Do people trust the platforms for this? And there was a 2022 survey from the UK Government Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. And this was an online study. They did have a telephone sample as well, but that wasn't included in the results here. And I think the key point here is that you can see on this slide here, the social media companies don't come out well in this study. They're not heavily trusted to either act in the best interests of people or keep their data safe. I mean, that raises a question of, why do people put quite so much information on social media if that is genuinely what they think about it? But nonetheless, there is a concern there. And I think one of the most interesting things that came out of that study was the importance of meaningful transparency about data use. And I'm going to come back to that as we go through some of the other material. Meaningful transparency. How do we provide meaningful transparency? And obviously in a traditional study, we'll do that with a participant information leaflet and a consent form and so on. But when we can't do that, how do we approach it? And I think one way to do that, and I will bring this out in a short while, is that we need to try and meet the expectations of those whose data we handle and analyze. Even if that data is being stewarded by others, we can provide meaningful transparency by trying to align what we do to the expectations of what's happening. So let's just come back briefly to this notion of public and private in the context of this data. And I'm going to use an analogy here of footpaths. So in the UK, we have this notion of public footpaths, and they're about as unrestricted as one could hope to get within an organization, within a country. They're dedicated to the public domain. You can walk on them. You have a right of way to walk on them, and such like. If we think about that in terms of public data, well, that's data that's been given to the public domain and is licensed irrevocably for people to use. By contrast, we also have land owned by gatekeepers or managed by gatekeepers, so land owned or managed by others. So there are paths, or various parts in the UK, that lie on private land. The National Trust, for example, owns an awful lot of it, and it's a gatekeeper in that respect. So we're familiar with gatekeepers in lots of other areas of research. So it's someone whose consent is needed to access our participants of interest or sets the terms of access to their domain. So in my own research, when we go and work at a school, we start by talking to the head of the school. The head is the gatekeeper to everything else, to the staff and to the students and so on. If we have their consent and we do a full consent exercise, then we move on. So in the context of our path analogy, the gatekeeper permits certain things to be done on their land and it can deny others. And this might change at different times of day or year. So you can't read the terms on this picture here, but it says you must keep dogs under close control, don't damage the trees, don't leave litter, don't light fires and so on. So the land use is governed by the landowner. What you can do on it is there. Now, technically, you could go and walk on that land and do all those things, and there isn't anyone there to stop you. No one's. It's not likely that someone is going to turn up and say you mustn't do that. In addition, private landowners can revoke their permission. They can say, right, we have a new rule. You may not now walk on this path, or this is closed at this point, and they can do that whenever. So what I'm introducing here, if you like, is the difference between legitimate and technical availability. So in the context of data, a lot of data is available technically, but not all of it is available legitimately. And so from a research ethics point of view, when we're looking at the provenance of a piece of data, and that doesn't have to be social media data, if we were looking at, I don't know, a secondary medical data set or something else, we would look at the provenance of that data. Was it gathered appropriately? Is it reasonable to use it for our investigation? So the land in this case is technically available, but not legitimately so. And we could make the same argument about a lot of data on social media. Yes, we could scrape it from websites. It's technically available. That does not make it legitimately so. And I summarize this with this term of private data on public display. So what we're dealing with, I think, in a lot of cases, not every case, but in a lot of cases in the social media area, is this notion of private data on public display. It's data that is not publicly owned or publicly controlled, but it is publicly visible. But it comes under terms of use, it comes under terms of collection, it's under someone else's control in terms of time and visibility, and it comes in under all kinds of different understandings and expectations. And again, there's another paper here that I think is an interesting read. These authors document their own experience and look at the evidence on different understandings of public and private spaces on the internet. And they note particularly that it's very hard to show that users are aware of the public nature of their contributions. And just because conversations happen in public, that doesn't mean the content should be regarded as public. And this brings us back to meaningful transparency. Can you show that your participants do that? If you can't, that doesn't necessarily prevent you from doing research. It just means that one has to think about the mitigations of risk in that case. We have other stakeholders involved in this too, because the platform is the thing that's setting the terms of what we go on here. So we have to be considering our platform as a stakeholder in the research as well as the participants, and I will come back to that in a moment. So I guess what I'm doing here is making an argument against the common position that's often put forward that this is all public data. Well, I would argue it's not public data, it's private data on public display, and there are terms about the way in which we can legitimately use that data. And our starting point for a piece of research in terms of research ethics should be to try and respect those. It may be that the demands of a particular investigation require us to not respect them, and that would have to be balanced in the justification between the benefit to society and the importance of the research. But it seems to me that our starting point should be that we respect the position of all the stakeholders involved. So at this point, I'm going to try and develop another analogy and use that to talk about how we might build an argument. So we're going to talk about bridge building, something in which I'm not a great expert, but it'll serve as an analogy. We have essentially non-local participants. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, we are separated from our research participants by the mediating data and the platforms. It doesn't mean they aren't our participants. It just means we don't have direct access to them. And this is something that was recognized and highlighted very usefully in the Menlo report in 2012, which was a report from the UST Homeland Department. And they looked at issues raised by the ICT context for research. They pick up things like varying legal regimes and social norms, the scale, the speed, excuse me, the scale, the speed, and the tight coupling. The fact that our interactions with humans are often indirect because of the increased logical and physical distance between researcher and researched, the ease with which you can do large-scale research, the larger range of stakeholders, and so on. So the challenges they talk about for ICT research in this sense, and the ethical challenges, are the researcher-subject relationship, because it's disconnected, dispersed, it's intermediated, proliferation of data sources, and the overlap between research and operations. And quite usefully, they extend the Belmont principles. So they add to the respect for persons principle, respecting those who are not targets of the research but are impacted. So for example, someone who's not on social media but is mentioned in someone else's social media post. They're not a target of the research necessarily, but they could be impacted by it. And they add a fourth principle of respect for law and the public interest, so covering things like legal due diligence and transparency of results and that kind of thing. And the legal due diligence is the one that comes in quite a lot. And although I've talked about Menlo here, I also would strongly recommend reading the Association of Internet Researchers ethics codes, because they're absolutely fantastic and really helpful in this space. So if we think here about distance being about kind of temporal, geographical, organizational, communicational separation proxied through data, what we need to do is bridge where we are as researchers to where our participants are in their space. And as I said earlier on, if we have the opportunity to use a participant information leaflet and a consent form, well, we can make our bridge very easily, because everyone's expectations become aligned. We say this is what you can expect if you participate in the study, and the participants know that that's what to expect. But the problem we have here is, of course, that we very often can't do consent. It's just not practical in terms of the scale. It's also not necessarily welcomed by participants. So there's been some interesting work in the mining software repositories area, where developers really dislike being surveyed by researchers, and they have said so. They don't want to have questionnaires sent to them to understand what they're doing. The title of the paper I'm thinking of, Beltez and al., is called Worse Than Spam. And it's about developer attitudes to that. So it's not always the case that even if you could do consent, it would be ethically justifiable to do so. because it might be seen as an intrusion. So if we can't do this, we need a different kind of bridge. So we need to start building our bridge, and please don't treat this as an exercise in civil engineering. I don't really know what's involved in building a bridge. I can do it in Lego, but we'll leave it at that. We're going to lay the foundations of our bridge on underpinning philosophies. Now, I'm not an expert in philosophical theory. My focus is practical ethics. But because we are building on philosophy, it's important that we have some understanding of what sits under there. So we could look at a utilitarian position where we're looking for the right action as being the one that produces the most good. But of course, we have to recognize that defining that good and over which audience is a difficult aspect. We might look at a more patient-centered deontological approach where we look at respecting the rights of the individual against being used as a means for other things. And these two positions may well be in tension in the social media research space. Individual rights over content use without consent versus the societal benefits of large-scale research where consent is impractical. And this brings us back to this notion, I put it on a previous slide, of consent and consequence. Is it the case that because somebody has put something in a social media platform and the consequence of that is that it can be made available to researchers, does that mean they've consented? I would argue it probably doesn't directly mean that, not at least not without some exploration. So at its foundation, we have underpinning philosophical positions, and it's useful to understand those. And one of the reasons I think we have to sort of at least have that in the back of our minds is that it builds depth in our ethical defense. It means that where we're challenged in putting forward a proposal, we have something to fall back on at each level. So the next stage, if you like, is building up the pillars of our bridge. So we've got our foundation in philosophy. At this point, we now need to say, right, well, how are we going to build up our bridge? So from an ethics standpoint, we need to think about consent, and since we can't get it explicitly, can we find it implicitly? Can we argue for understanding expectation and therefore implicit consent? And where do we find that information? Well, we see it in terms of data access conditions, the terms and conditions of the sites that we're using. And those things don't just establish what a company says we can do with the data as a researcher, but in a sense, they form part of the package of terms to which the potential participant agreed as well. We tend to think of participants reading what someone says, okay, we can make our data available for research, but it may be that that participant said, but what research, and has a look at the downstream uses as well. So we have to see that whole package of terms as part of what the participant, if you like, potentially consented to. So we're trying to respect here the positions of the stakeholder, all the stakeholders involved, the platform and the participant. And these things can not just affect what you can access, but also how you do it. So normally it's not a problem to read things as a human being on these sorts of sites. Some sites offer programmatic access, and they often come with extra contractual stuff. But what's very often barred is scraping data. Most website terms I look at have an explicit bar on scraping data, and quite a few are starting to have them now for not just scraping, but also using it for training machine learning and AI models. There's also potentially data protection implications for that. There was a joint statement of data regulators in August 23 from around the world pointing out that scraping personal information from websites raises privacy concerns even when that data is publicly accessible. The social media companies have obligations to try and prevent that scraping because it could be a reportable data breach. So again, when we're talking about the ethical concerns, not just of the people whose data we're looking at, but also the intermediary platforms who have ethical interest in this too. There may be other requirements like synchronization and so on. So we'd have to also look at data protection law. We have to look at, so this contract law is really what covers the terms and conditions. We may also have aspects of intellectual property law. So if we are, for example, wanting to do a large scale study involving facial data and we're pulling photos from the internet, there are potentially intellectual property law things to that. Anonymity might be seen as the answer to some of this, but it can be hard to achieve. There's a paper by Mason and Singh in the Research Ethics Journal in 2022. They looked at 136 education manuscripts quoting 2,667 tweets. Almost half of all the manuscripts and half of the quoted tweets were identifiable back to authors, even though they had been ostensibly anonymized. It's a very difficult area to do anonymity in. So if we can come up with an argument that examines these things and builds it, we have the pillars of our bridge. And so now we can start making our final case to bridge the gap between us. And I put this together as what I call like an implied consent argument. So this is one way of framing it. Variations would work. So if the contract, the terms and conditions offered to those providing the data, clearly explains the public disposition of that data and the controls that the person providing it has, and if the gatekeeper permits the proposed use of the data, then the visibility of that data in public could, I think, be justifiably argued as implied consent through agreement to the contract. But my point is, I think it has to be argued. I don't think it can just be assumed. I think there's an expectation of a kind of examination and so on in a research proposal that says, okay, this is how we've reached this conclusion. But I would say that if the data ceases to be visible in public, then the argument fails to hold. So once public data does not mean always public data in this context because of user controls. You know, if the users are being promised control over the visibility of their data, it does not seem prima facie that it should be something that that can be maintained in research use if the data is taken away. So in the context of our bridge, you know, nice complete bridge while it's publicly visible, take the public visibility pillar away, we no longer have a bridge, although by the magic physics of Lego, it stays up. So that's all fine. And as I've said, you know, my starting point in thinking about this would always be, let's respect stakeholders' wishes, but is that always a reasonable thing to do? Let's have a look at some responses. So Bruns wrote a very interesting paper in 2019, looking at how researchers can and could and should respond to the increasing use of APIs to make this data available. And argues that there are 4 things you can do. One is you can just walk away, stop doing the research. Another one is you can lobby for change. You can try and get the companies to make the data more available. You can accommodate and acquiesce, which is kind of where I've started from, but not necessarily where one can finish. Or you could break the rules and ignore them. And that's, to my mind, where one then has to weigh up the ethical balance and the risks involved. The platforms have responded to this in some cases. So there is one example I quote here, which is I'm going on press reporting here, by the way. I don't have any inside information on this, but there were some press reports that Facebook had sent a cease and desist letter to some researchers at New York University who were studying things on their platform, and subsequently disabled the personal accounts of those researchers on the basis of breaching the terms. So there are potentially direct backlash consequences to the researchers concerned if they're doing it. The other paper I've just added on that slide there also is interesting because that's a paper where the terms, conditions of API use and law and so on are used very effectively to justify an ethical approach to the way the data is being used. So it's a very positive way of using those things to justify. I think it's a project that happened a few years ago. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to take no more than at most 5 more minutes to talk about this. Having kind of set all of that up, what I want to do is, in the final part of my talk, kind of play tour guide for you in this landscape of terms and just pull out a few key highlights of things I've noticed in terms that could have an impact on how you frame an argument in research or the kind of research methods that it have. I want to be clear that some of these things I looked at a couple of years ago, so they may well have changed. One of them I looked at 2 months ago, and I think it's already changed. So this is a very dynamic landscape, and if you're working in this space, you really have to be on top of what's going on and just checking that things aren't changing while you're doing the research. Because often the way these things are set up, it says if you carry on using it after whatever date, the new terms apply to you. So things can change in the middle of your investigation. So I'm hoping this will be of some interest. By no means comprehensive coverage of any of these websites. And as I say, you really do need to do your own due diligence when it comes to actually an investigation. I'm going to start with X. X is a little bit less accessible than it was because of the changes to the charging structure, but it's a really nice way of illustrating some of the complexity around this. So I think what we have here is a picture of what I think most people would think of as an X research setup. You have X, the platform, you have some people tweeting, you have some people reading those tweets, and then over here you have the data harvesters, the researchers who are accessing it through an API. And on the surface, that's what it looks like. But we can start adding things to that. So first of all, let's include the temporal visibility control. So tweeters can decide whether or not their stuff stays on the site. They can decide whether to hide it. And they can do that at any time. So in actual fact, the data legitimately available to someone harvesting is only what the tweeter says is available to them at a given time, and that can change. We then need to acknowledge the contractual relationships. So we actually have 2 contracts in place here, one between X and the people providing the data, and another one between X and the harvesters. So we have some terms of use and things like that. We need to acknowledge the ethical relationships. So we have a kind of direct consent relationship between X and the harvesters because you have to apply for a permission to use it and so on. So there's contract involved in that. But we also have an indirect one, an implicit consent argument, perhaps along the lines I've outlined, between the tweeters and the harvesters. These are the participants in the research as well as X, but we're acknowledging both stakeholders. We then have to think about processing and inference, because there are rules about what you can do. So X bans you from certain types of inference. There are certain things you're not allowed to do with the data you get from the platform. You're not allowed to, for example, infer health data or political affiliation for an individual. You can do it on aggregate, but you can't do it for an individual. That the last time I read it. We need to add synchronization compliance. So if you're pulling data off of the X site, then you have to maintain it in synchrony with the online site. So there's no sense of this being a static secondary data set. It's a dynamic, ever-changing data set. So if you're intending to comply with the rules, that's one of the things you have to consider. If you want to share your data for things like research replication, well, that becomes, there are rules around that too. You can only share the IDs, not the actual tweets. And therefore, your data user has to go and rehydrate those tweets from the site, which is how they then intend to respect the deletion status and so on. So there's that. And then if you actually want to publish a tweet in your publication, there is some best practice guidance around this from the research councils in the UK and so on. And the best practice guidance is that you basically go and seek direct consent permission from the person who tweeted, because otherwise you're sharing tweet data, which is not permitted by the API in a publication. So you would perhaps need direct consent for that. My point here is just to say what looked like a really simple scenario at the start has all of these issues around it that need to be thought through, addressed, and built into research method. Let's look at a few others. Facebook, I looked at a couple of years ago. It has some prohibitions on data processing. There are things you can't do on it. You can't share very much Facebook data at all, only at the direction of the person who's provided it and with proof of consent. And there's some other contractual thing there as well. You have to maintain the live status synchronization, and you can't scrape it. And in fact, Facebook are quite active in trying to prevent scraping. YouTube has lots of similar things. You can't scrape it. You can't collect or use information that might identify someone without consent. So you can't, according to these terms, do a large-scale study on YouTube for, I don't know, facial recognition where you're actually trying to tie it to a particular individual. Again, similar sorts of things to X in terms of what you can't infer about somebody. Perhaps the most useful thing they say here is don't surprise your users. And again, synchronization. Reddit's changed a little bit of late. Again, synchronization requirement. They can choose to review what you're doing on the site if they wish to. One of the most significant things here, I think, is the fact that there is a term that says you must comply with any requirements or restrictions placed on the content usage by users. So if someone says all rights reserved, or Creative Commons license, whatever, you are obliged, if you're using data through the API, to my understanding, to respect that. And that, to me, makes large-scale studies very difficult, because you'd actually have to examine every piece of data that came back, I think, to check that. And you can't use this data now for training large language models or RAI things. Foursquare, which is a geolocation restaurant finding type technology company. I picked this up in a review a couple of months ago. They limited the kind of content you could cache offline, and it depends on what kind of contract you have as well. So there are variations even within that. And where you can cache it. You can't cache it on a server, you can only put it on a device. But when I looked for these last couple of days, I couldn't find them again. So it may be that these terms have already changed, just as an illustration of how fast it moves, because this was only November that I did this review. TikTok is probably one of the newest ones. It's quite an interesting API. It's only just come to the Europe. It was, when I looked a couple of months ago, it was only available in the US. There are various requirements for TikTok. You have to have lots of demonstrable experience to be able to get an account at all. They have a very specific data refresh, so it's 15 days. You have to keep your synchronization. You can only keep data for as long as your thing is active. One of the more controversial things that's been done is the fact that you have to provide them with your publications and supporting information at least 7 days before publication. Primarily, they say to identify private personal data to be removed. It doesn't say what any secondary purpose might be, but that's their primary one. You can't redistribute content. You can't publish research outputs that violate the API terms. So that's an interesting challenge if you felt like your research justified it. And you mustn't publish outputs if they can be linked back to a specific user or other individual. So I think that potentially invalidates the X approach, where you'd say, I'm going to go to this person and get consent to publish their tweet. I don't think you'd be able to here, because if it could be linked back, you'd be breaching the API terms, and strictly speaking, you'd be publishing an output that violated it. They also gain some license to your publications for use internally and for marketing and things. And finally, in this, I'm going to start with having given you all the doom and gloom of all the complexities that exist. Stack Overflow, should you be working in the area of looking at what programmers discuss. This is a site where programmers go to seek help. All the contributions on Stack Overflow are licensed under Creative Commons. All the content's posted under Creative Commons, and occasionally the site even provides its own data dumps under Creative Commons. So there are some sites out there that make this kind of thing very easy, as long as the kind of social media you're interested in happens to fit with them. So a slightly more positive one to finish there. So practical recommendations, just to sum everything up. My feeling is it's a good idea to know the basics of the underpinning philosophies, to pick one or more ethics codes. Often, in this kind of study, you need at least 2 ethics codes, because you're going to need something around the technological side and something around the domain side of what you're doing. Look at how you resolve your core ethics issues like consent, dissemination, anonymity, and so on. Do your legal due diligence. Check your times of access. What do you need to do for the research? Is there a tension between those things? If you need to argue to breach the terms, fine, but then you probably need to seek advice on the risks you're posing to yourself and the organization in breaching those terms. If you do, look at your data protection alignments and so on. Then pull together your ethical argument, lay it out so it's meaningfully transparent. It's possible that your ethics paperwork could be made available under Freedom of Information Act, so you are basically justifying your work to the public, and then apply for your ethical approval and legal compliance steps as you need to. So my conclusion is, I think that researchers need to be rigorous and explicit in their analysis of the environment, to document that ethical defense with meaningful transparency. I think RECs or IRBs, depending on your context, need to be flexible in accepting ethical defenses that don't fit the norm of an explicit informed consent up front. In my experience, that hasn't been a problem, but I hear stories that this can be a particularly difficult area. So I think there is a challenge for RECs and IRBs there as well, to be broad in their thinking and so on. Properly considered risk should not prevent research happening, but it does have to be properly considered and documented. And I think the challenge on the governance side is that ethics consideration really needs to be ongoing and fine-grained. Actually, it's not just a governance challenge, it's a research challenge too. This is a very dynamic environment. It needs to be watched even while the research is happening, to make sure that things haven't changed, that ethical risks aren't changing, and so on. And I think from a governance side, the scrutiny processes need to be able to facilitate that, and very often they don't. We tend to have quite a one-shot model of ethics that you apply for approval and then it's done. And I think an interesting challenge from the government's point of view is, could we facilitate that in a more flexible way, in an ongoing way, and thereby increase the kind of ethical safety? And with that, I will reach the end. So thank you very much for your attention. And yes, I look forward to seeing what questions James pulled out of the chat.
Nicholas, that was fascinating, and not just least for the amazing use of Lego, of your diagram of, sorry, I can't call it X, Twitter, and the simple structure we all think is there, and then adding in the various levels of complexity were fascinating. It was also, and then seeing the comparison and how the different sites approach it, Reddit saying you can't use your content of LMNs, for example, all these things coming up. And I have to confess, my apologies to any diehard users, I'd forgotten about Foursquare. I hadn't heard that name for a while. Then again, maybe it's, I'm in my 50s, maybe it's, aimed at people dramatically younger than me, as many things are these days. Okay, we had lots of interesting questions in the Q&A. I'll start pulling those out. Please do add to those. We'll answer as many questions as we can. Okay. Beck Lowe asks a question about TikTok. With a platform like TikTok, which is less conversational and more a matter of everyone presenting at each other, it's difficult to gauge how private that conversation was intended to be, i.e. community versus virality. Is this where the context of the content needs to be considered, i.e. assess each video and hashtag community on a case-by-case basis?
Yes, I would say so. I think it's... I would look at it in terms of Nissenbaum's contextual integrity, which goes back to, I think, about 2004, but it crops up in various places, and you'll see it mentioned in the Association of Internet Researchers Code, I think. So the notion of, is it appropriate to share a particular piece of information? Is it appropriate for it to be shared in this particular way? So it's a very reflexive kind of look at what's happening. TikTok actually, I'm just going to flick back in the slides there and see if I made a note. Yeah, they do actually make quite a lot of information available through their API. So information on accounts, on profiles, on followers, and a lot of content, including comments on videos and so on. So there is, I guess the issues you might see there would be similar to those you might see on YouTube, in terms of there's a video and then there's content. And one of the things you could look at in that discussion might be, and I suspect this is more YouTube than it is TikTok, but might be how what quality of production has been used. So is this someone who's quickly sort of recorded something and it's not clear that it was intended as a really published thing? Maybe they're just talking to their small group of followers, versus is this a professionally produced influencer who is, you know, doing this sort of thing? So I think, you know, you'd look at all of that context to come to the conclusion as to what was a reasonable thing to do in that case, and then balance it against what are you expecting to get from the research.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Karen and then Rebecca asked related questions. Karen says, you know, if you argue implied consent to use someone tweets, but if they delete those tweets at some point in the future, the consent doesn't hold. So how does that work in practice? Do you have to kind of keep checking back to see if tweets are still viewable? And Rebecca says, you know, if you're at the analysis and at the write-up stage and data later disappears from public view, so someone makes their account private or leaves the platform, do you have to remove that data from your data set, or is it fine to leave it in as long as everything's kind of anonymized and, you know, back tracing is therefore presented? So with, you know, how do you handle consent if data goes, and how do you handle things in the data set if data goes?
So I'm going to separate two issues there. One is about whether that data is publicly somewhere, like in a paper, and what you're doing within your kind of local data set. So if you are respecting the terms as I understand them, you are required to reflect in your offline data changes in the online data. If something's protected, if it becomes deleted, goes private, or whatever, you are required to, as soon, I can't exactly the wording, but it sort of implies it's very soon, reflect that in your offline data, which would mean that it would disappear from your local data set. And this flows through into the way they do the sharing, in that you can share the ID, but the ID may not resolve to anything later. So in terms of your own data set, yes, my understanding of the terms would be that that data should disappear from what you're doing. You shouldn't have it for any great length of time after that. In practical terms, when I'm reviewing, and again, this was the case up to the point when X removed the research API, because now, as I understand it, you can only do chargeable APIs, and some of the compliance APIs that come with that are only available in chargeable stuff. But if you are able to continue doing research in that way, there is a thing called the batch compliance API. And what it allows you to do is upload a list of all the IDs you have in your local data store, and then X runs something on their servers, and they leave you another file that you can download again, and it tells you the current status of all the tweets that you asked about, and the tweets and the user IDs you asked about, and then you can update it. And that file exists on the platform for about a week. And so I have taken that as the rule of thumb to say, okay, well, they assume that within a week, then you can update your local data store. So I personally, when I'm reviewing in that space, I would be suggesting that researchers would be doing a weekly update. They would push up to the platform. And when I look at data retention protocols, for, you know, we're going to keep this data set for however long, it's an active retention. It's not just, yes, it sits on our server. There needs to be a mechanism. If one is intending to comply with the terms, there needs to be a mechanism by which every week, or however long you agree with your ethics body, that update happens, so that your local data, which is why I said earlier on, this is not a static secondary data set. This is not like we've got it and it exists. This is a live data set, and all you're doing by having it locally is caching the state of the platform as it stands now. Coming on to what happens if it's visible, and do you have to get rid of it? This is where and why the good practice guidance exists, that you go and ask permission to quote it. Because yes, if you were abiding strictly by the terms of the API, you could put that in a paper, and if the thing disappeared, you would at that point have shared content that can no longer be made available. If you've been to somebody and said, I've done a study and I would like to quote your tweet, then you have their permission to do that, and it sort of doesn't matter what they do with it on the platform, because you've got you know, an informed consent at that point for what you want to do with it, which is to publish it. It's a tricky
really
area.
Helpful. Thank you.
The tricky area, and one I have had many long discussions with many people about, in terms of, you know, finding the right approach.
Yeah, it's very much a case-by-case basis, but it's great you're providing some themes and linking to guidance and papers that can help us explore the complexities. Okay, we've had some similar questions from Rebecca, Robin, Rachel, and Sonia, who are asking about, is there a difference between sort of a personal account, an account that say belongs to an influencer or a celebrity, or an account that has say 100,000 followers, people who are kind of using social media for, to get clout, to get virality. And also, is there a difference between, individual accounts and organizational accounts, where it's, representing a group or a body or a corporation, for example, or they're all treated the same regardless of the nature of the person or organization behind the social media account and how many followers it want, if it's got 100k followers, or for example, that impact on the privacy and data protection and ethical concerns?
So I think it's coming to the first point. I think the starting point for the principles would be the same, but you may well come to a different ethical conclusion in terms of the intentionality of the data. So if you're looking to say, is this public or private, and it's someone who is knowingly publishing things, and you could say, yes, this appears to be very much published, not just. I'm just hearing myself coming back through a system somewhere here. I don't know why, but if it's published, not it's manifestly published or very clearly published, I think you could reach an ethical determination that this is that one could afford to be perhaps less protective of that data. It would not affect your data protection position, to my understanding of data protection, or you still have all the, it doesn't matter whether it's public or not. It still falls under the same data protection position. There may be risk-based things you can do in that area around the fact that it's prior public disclosure and that sort of thing, but in principle, it doesn't, I don't think, change anything. But again, not a lawyer, so ask a data protection person. Coming to the second point about organizations, at that point, I think certainly from where I'm sitting in UCL, organizational data doesn't fall within our ethics policy because it's not human-derived data in that sense. It's corporate personality. So you might look at it from an ethics point of view of, is this study likely to raise ethics issues in terms of, I don't know, say bad things about a company and cause it to lose market share or something like that? And you'd have to consider those broader ethics, which you would in that kind of study. But I think you have a slightly different set of things. I mean, you could argue they're a new stakeholder in the process. You've got the personal, and then you've got the other thing, and you might have particular people within the company who are managing that account. And if they're known as the people managing that account, well, then yes, the ethical position slightly changes again, because they're doing that for their job. It's not their personal expression, but you might still be handling some personal data. Versus if you just have a corporate account, which is essentially faceless, it's just company X tweeted this. Well, it's corporate, it's not personal data at that point, and so some of the sensitivities perhaps fall away, or different sensitivities turn up in the kind of study you're doing. And so again, this comes back to, what does your ethics policy say? At UCL, we know what falls within our policy for human data. There's also a sensitive research policy, and so if we were looking at an investigation that was likely to cause sensitivities for companies, I'd probably pick it up in ethics from that point of view. But it's a different area of ethical consideration with some of the same aspects, because you've got some of the same stakeholders involved.
That's really interesting. Thank you. I think we've got time for one more set of questions. We've got a few people from members of ethics committees, and there's a general question of how much kind of ethical defense information should we expect researchers to provide in their submission if they want to use social media data, and also should there be, if you have long-term, should you have expectations of long-term dissemination, so the impact of this stuff being out there for sort of more than 10 years or so when you're applying for ethical approval?
So I think in terms of how much information should a researcher provide, if I pick up the sort of Markham position of ethics as method as ethic, this is part of a researcher's research method. To my position on it, and it is my position, would be that as a researcher, I need to be able to demonstrate that I understand the ethics of what I'm doing. It's not for the research ethics committee to tell me what the ethics should be. You may have ethics advisors and ethics training, and that's all fine, but the ethics committee that's assessing it, I think, should reasonably expect a researcher to be able to document what they've considered. It comes back to my point about meaningful transparency. the ethics committee is representing, in one sense, the public, and so it's their job to look at the case that's been made. That said, there's nothing wrong with, and indeed it's helpful to advise researchers on what they need to do. Whether that's the ethics committee's job to do that advice, or whether there's an adjunct function that does that alongside it, I don't know. But I think the point is, it is not unreasonable to expect researchers to be able to tell you what they're doing in their research and the risks involved in doing it. That seems to me to be a reasonable position. As far as the long-term aspects of the data and the data retention goes, I think in one sense, I don't think it's any different to any other kind of data that you're proposing to retain for the long term. It's long-term data retention, and one can assess the risks of that. I think the trickier part here is that you don't really have the data. You may have a local copy of data on a platform somewhere, and so then it becomes a question of, are you going to respect that platform's terms and conditions in terms of synchronization, and how are you going to maintain that? I mean, it's a genuinely challenging technical question. And if you're thinking of trying to maintain a data set that replicates X or something like that for 10 or 15 years, who in the organization is going to do that? How is that data retention going to work? Because it can't just be passive. It's not a file sitting on a server somewhere. It needs an infrastructure. It needs to run regularly. Someone needs to maintain it. So these are not straightforward questions, but they are questions I would ask of a researcher if I had my ethics committee hat on, and if I was doing the research, it'd be questions that I would be addressing in my application, because it's all research method, and it's simply addressing the ethics implications of my research method. And I think what happens is that there's an underestimation in a lot of cases of the complexity of doing this kind of research. It looks like really simple. Hey, great, there's a huge pile of data out there. We can do some interesting analysis. Well, you can, but it's not actually that straightforward. It's as complicated as setting up your lab to do your physics experiment or something like that. There's risk involved. There are things you do. There are things you don't do. And if you're going to work in this space, then you should seek information about those things. And this is why I say you often need more than one ethics code, because one ethics code isn't necessarily going to cover the full spectrum of issues you need to think about, because it's a computational enabling and perhaps of another discipline. I don't know if that helps. But anyway, that's my thought.
No, it's very good thoughts, very informative thoughts, as it have been for the entirety of this session. And I think you're right that this can seem simple. Wow, there's so much stuff out there, and what an amazing mine of the source of data and information on people and societal movements and all sorts of things. But oh my goodness, the complexities. Nicolas, we've hit our time, and I have to thank you very, very much, because you've been the only speaker. You kept this webinar going single-handed. I've done very little, so thank you so much for your time today. It's been a really interesting event. We've had lots of fantastic